Why is the world's third largest oil producer suddenly buying gasoline from a country that barely makes any of its own? Why is Vladimir Putin quietly begging his smallest, poorest neighbor to keep Russian cars running? Before we answer that, do one quick thing for me. Hit like right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep tracking stories the big networks won't touch. Subscribe if this is your first time here, and if you want your friends to actually understand what's happening inside Russia right now, send this to them. Okay, let's get into it. For decades, the relationship between these two countries only moved in one direction. Russia was the giant. Belarus was the smaller neighbor that depended on it for cheap oil, for cheap gas, for basic survival. Moscow held the leverage. Moscow always called the shots. That is not what is happening anymore. Right now, Russia is sending its own crude oil into Belarus, watching it get turned into finished fuel by two old Soviet-era refineries, and then paying to bring that same fuel back home. The world's third biggest oil producer, a country that once used energy exports as a weapon against the whole of Europe, is now dependent on a smaller neighbor just to keep its own gas stations open. That is not a small detail. That is a warning sign. Something inside Russia's fuel system is breaking, and it has been breaking for months. Here's how strange this arrangement actually is. Russian crude oil flows through the Druzhba pipeline into Belarus. From there, it goes to one of two aging refineries, one near the city of Mozyr, the other in Novopolotsk. These refineries turn the crude into gasoline and diesel. Then, instead of staying in Belarus, that finished fuel gets loaded onto rail cars and shipped straight back across the border into Russia. Crude oil goes out, finished fuel comes back in. Belarus is essentially renting out its refineries to fix a problem inside Russia that Russia cannot fix on its own. And there is a financial trick buried inside this whole system too. Russian companies send their crude to Belarus under what is called a tolling arrangement. Whatever fuel comes back from those two refineries then qualifies for a government subsidy that covers the gap between what it actually costs to import that fuel and the much lower price Russian drivers pay at the pump. Without that subsidy, this entire arrangement would barely make financial sense. With it, Moscow can keep pretending everything is under control. The subsidy program did not always cover imported fuel. Reporting indicates that earlier this summer, new rules were signed specifically to extend that subsidy to cover gasoline brought in from countries like Belarus, backdated to the start of June. Weeks later, lawmakers extended the same coverage to diesel, too. In other words, the Kremlin had to quietly rewrite its own financial rulebook, just to make this emergency lifeline affordable. And the price tag on that broader subsidy program is staggering. Reporting places the total cost at roughly 2.6 trillion rubles in a single year, somewhere near $35 billion. That number alone represents close to half of Russia's entire federal budget shortfall for the year. Think about that. Nearly half of the government's total deficit is tied up in propping up a fuel system that keeps failing. Russian officials have tried hard to paint a calmer picture in public. Government spokespeople have claimed that fuel restrictions were being lifted and that long lines at gas stations were shrinking. Independent researchers studying the situation describe something different, a kind of manufactured appearance of stability, propped up specifically by redirecting fuel away from struggling regions and toward the capital, just to keep Moscow looking fine while everywhere else quietly ran dry. Now look at the actual numbers moving across that border, because they tell a story all on their own. In July alone, Belarus shipped over 200,000 metric tons of gasoline into Russia, a sharp jump from the month before. Across the first 7 months of the year, gasoline shipments from Belarus into Russia surged by a factor of more than 20 compared to the same period the year before. Not 20%, more than 20 times the volume. Diesel shipments climbed dramatically too. This is not a minor adjustment. This is an entire supply chain being rerouted out of desperation. There is one more detail hidden in these numbers worth pausing on. Jet fuel shipments from Belarus actually dipped slightly during this same stretch. That small decline matters because it shows Belarus itself has limits. It cannot simply produce endless fuel on demand. As Russia asks for more and more, Minsk has to stretch its own limited refining capacity across multiple products at once, and something eventually has to give. So why does a country sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on the planet need this much help just to keep its pumps running? The answer is not about oil in the ground. It is about what happens to that oil once it needs to become usable fuel, and that is exactly where Ukraine has been striking, again and again with remarkable precision. Crude oil sitting underground is worthless to a driver at a gas station. Somewhere between the ground and the fuel tank sits a refinery, the machine that actually turns raw oil into something usable. And that machine, across dozens of locations inside Russia, has been under sustained attack for years now. By some counts, Ukraine has carried out over 150 confirmed strikes against Russian oil refineries since the start of the war, hitting the majority of the country's largest processing facilities. A couple of specific refineries have been struck more than a dozen times each, hit, partially repaired, then hit again before repairs could even finish. These are not random strikes either. Drones are targeting the most critical processing units inside each facility, the exact components needed to convert crude into usable fuel. Destroy those specific units, and a refinery cannot simply switch to some backup system. It just stops functioning. One industry analyst summed up why this campaign has been so damaging. The scale, coordination, and repeated timing of these strikes leave repair crews with almost no window to fix anything before the next wave arrives. One well-documented case involved a refinery that got hit, began repairs, and then was struck again before those repairs were even finished. Russia has tried defending these sites. Extra air defense systems have been moved in. Protective netting has gone up over some facilities, specifically designed to intercept incoming drones. None of it has been enough to stop the pattern. By early summer, gasoline production inside Russia had fallen to roughly 2/3 of what the country actually needed during peak season. Diesel production barely covered domestic demand at all, leaving almost nothing left over for export. During the busiest months of the year, when demand for gasoline is at its highest, the country was producing only a fraction of what it required every single day, leaving a daily shortfall large enough to be measured in tens of thousands of tons. That is not a minor supply hiccup. That is a structural collapse hiding just beneath the surface. Quick pause here. If your jaw is already on the floor, wait until you hear where Russia went looking for backup fuel next. But first, drop a comment telling me what you think Putin does. If this shortage keeps getting worse, I want to hear your take. And if you haven't already, tap subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this breakdown. Faced with that kind of shortfall, the Kremlin had only two real options: cut demand or find fuel somewhere else. It tried both, and the search for outside fuel took Russia to some genuinely strange places. India became one unexpected source, with shipments arriving from a refinery there that processes crude originally linked back to Russia itself. Picture that for a second. Russian-linked oil, refined on the other side of the world, then shipped back across multiple oceans just to fill a gap Russia could not fill on its own. One energy analyst described the arrival of these Indian shipments as deeply revealing, a clear signal of just how serious the domestic imbalance had become. Kazakhstan sent limited quantities too, even while protecting its own fuel reserves with export restrictions of its own. And in a moment that genuinely stunned energy watchers, Russia received a shipment of gasoline from Morocco, a country with essentially no significant oil production of its own. A tanker loaded fuel there and hauled it all the way to a Russian Arctic port. Think about the strangeness of that image. One of the largest oil-producing nations on the planet, importing gasoline from a country that barely produces any oil at all. Even with all these imports combined, analysts calculated that the total volume from India, Belarus, and Kazakhstan together would only cover roughly 1/3 of Russia's actual monthly shortfall. Moscow could search the entire globe for spare fuel, and the math still would not balance. So the government moved to protect what little fuel remained. Export bans on diesel and gasoline were introduced and then extended further into the future. Restrictions tightened region by region, and the way those restrictions got applied revealed something uncomfortable about who actually matters to this regime and who does not. Crimea, the territory Russia spent years insisting was sacred, non-negotiable, permanently Russian, became one of the hardest hit regions. Gasoline there has reportedly been sold through strict rationing, with tight weekly limits per person and cash sales suspended in some areas. Meanwhile, the capital was protected almost completely. Fuel was quietly redirected from refineries in Siberia, specifically to keep Moscow's 22 million residents comfortable, even as other regions were left running dry. The government that promised the war would strengthen the country ended up sacrificing the very territory it claimed to have fought hardest to protect, just to keep the capital looking stable on camera. And that kind of sacrifice does not stay hidden for long. By late summer, long lines had reappeared across a dozen or more regions, some of which had never experienced fuel problems before. Certain gas stations stopped selling higher-grade fuel entirely. Some regions capped purchases at painfully small amounts per visit. Russian drivers who had spent years taking cheap, abundant fuel for granted were suddenly facing something that felt genuinely unfamiliar: uncertainty about whether the pump would even have anything left when they arrived. In one especially telling move, officials approved allowing lower quality, outdated fuel standards back into circulation, grades Russia had officially phased out over a decade earlier. For ordinary drivers, that mostly means faster engine wear. For military vehicles built around higher fuel specifications, it can mean real mechanical damage, engines breaking down under strain they were never designed to handle. That is the trade Russia is making right now, long-term damage to its own equipment in exchange for keeping fuel flowing through the pumps today. There's also a financial dimension to all this rationing that rarely gets enough attention. Every liter of fuel Russia imports from Belarus, India, Kazakhstan, or Morocco arrives more expensive than fuel refined domestically ever was. Shipping costs, tolling fees, and subsidy payments all stack on top of each other. The government absorbs part of that cost to keep pump prices from spiking too visibly, but absorbing cost is not the same as solving a problem. It simply moves the pain somewhere else, into the budget, into inflation, into whatever program eventually gets cut to cover the gap. A country cannot subsidize its way out of a structural shortage forever. Eventually, either the subsidies shrink, or the prices rise, or the shortages get worse. None of those options are politically comfortable, and all three are currently unfolding at once, just at different speeds in different regions. Even the transportation method carrying all this rescue fuel has its own limits. Crude flows into Belarus through a pipeline, but there is no equivalent pipeline sending finished fuel back the other way. Everything has to travel by rail instead, tanker car after tanker car, and that rail system was never designed to handle volumes this large. As monthly shipments keep climbing, that bottleneck becomes harder and harder to avoid. Belarus's 2 refineries have a combined capacity that sounds impressive on paper, but in practice, they typically run at a fraction of that number. And Belarus needs a meaningful share of that output just to cover its own domestic needs. What is left over for Russia is a genuinely thin margin, and every drop of that margin is now being squeezed. The consequences of this arrangement are not staying contained inside Russia and Belarus either. They are spreading outward into Central Asia. Countries that depended heavily on Russian fuel exports suddenly found themselves scrambling. Some governments moved to ban their own fuel exports just to protect domestic supply. Others rushed to sign emergency contracts with alternate suppliers and quietly expanded their own reserves as a buffer against what might be coming. Nations that had nothing to do with this war are now absorbing real economic pain simply because the country they depended on for fuel can no longer reliably supply itself, let alone anyone else. Think about how strange that regional picture actually is. For decades, smaller countries in this part of the world planned their entire energy strategy around one basic assumption: that Russia would always have fuel to sell. Government budgets, transportation systems, agricultural schedules, all of it quietly built on top of that single assumption. Now that assumption is cracking, and countries that never fired a single shot in this war are having to rewrite their own energy planning in real time, signing new contracts, building new reserves, searching for new partners, all because the regional giant they once depended on suddenly cannot even guarantee fuel for itself. Inside Russia, the picture kept getting worse through the second half of the year. Reports of rationing and shortages eventually touched the overwhelming majority of the country's regions. Some areas introduced odd and even license plate systems, allowing drivers to purchase fuel only on alternating days based on their plate numbers. Purchase limits shrank further. Some stations stopped operating altogether. Regional officials, usually careful to project confidence, began publicly admitting the situation was difficult and telling residents not to expect meaningful improvement anytime soon, and in a detail that says everything about where ordinary citizens actually rank in the system. Government fuel allocation priorities reportedly placed state institutions, municipal services, defense contractors, and agricultural producers ahead of everyday drivers. Regular civilians, people driving to work or picking up their kids, sit near the very bottom of that list. The population that keeps this entire system running is the last group considered when fuel actually runs short. There's a political dimension to this crisis too, one that goes far beyond gas station lines. Fuel shortages are not an abstract statistic to ordinary people. They are something felt directly, every single week, every time someone needs to drive to work, transport goods, or simply get their children to school. Governments can survive plenty of quiet economic pain as long as it stays mostly invisible, tucked away in budget reports and inflation numbers most citizens never read closely. Fuel shortages do not stay invisible. They show up as a line stretching down the block. They show up as a sign taped to a pump reading "No gasoline today." That kind of visible failure chips away at public confidence in a way that abstract numbers rarely do. And this is happening at a particularly sensitive moment. Russia has spent years telling its population that the war would ultimately make the country stronger, more self-sufficient, less dependent on the outside world. Watching gasoline arrive from Morocco, of all places, or watching Crimea, the territory held up as the proudest achievement of this entire war, get placed under strict rationing, directly contradicts that story. People do not need economics degrees to notice the gap between what they were promised and what they are actually experiencing at the pump. There is also a quieter, more strategic problem building underneath all of this, one connected directly to the military itself. Fuel does not just move civilian cars. It moves fuel trucks, supply convoys, armored vehicles, and aircraft. A refining system already stretched thin trying to cover domestic civilian demand has far less flexibility to absorb sudden military fuel demands without consequences somewhere else in the chain. Every leader redirected to keep Moscow's gas stations stocked is a leader that has to come from somewhere. And increasingly, that somewhere is regions and sectors that cannot easily absorb the loss. The decision to reintroduce outdated, lower-grade fuel standards is itself a quiet admission of this pressure. A government choosing short-term availability over long-term reliability, even when that choice risks damaging the very equipment it needs functioning for years to come. Meanwhile, the people around Putin, the officials, the regional governors, the industry executives responsible for keeping the system running are left managing an impossible balancing act. Keep the capital comfortable enough to avoid unrest in the most politically sensitive city in the country. Keep enough fuel flowing to the military that operational readiness does not visibly collapse. And somehow still project an image of stability to a population that can plainly see empty pumps with their own eyes. Every region forced into rationing, every governor forced to publicly admit a difficult situation, chips away a little more at the illusion that this system is fully under control. Here's the part that should genuinely worry the Kremlin more than anything else. The Belarus lifeline itself has a ceiling, and Russia may have already slammed straight into it. Energy analysts have estimated Belarus's realistic export capacity for gasoline at somewhere around 1.5 to 2 million metric tons per year. July's shipment volumes alone were already pushing well past that sustainable pace. In other words, Russia is not just relying on Belarus. It may already be squeezing more out of that relationship than it can reasonably sustain. Now imagine what happens if Ukraine decides to strike those two Belarusian refineries directly. Ukrainian officials have reportedly identified hundreds of potential targets inside Belarus connected to Russia's war effort. Military analysts have pointed out that if Ukrainian drones can already reach refineries deep inside Russian territory, hundreds of kilometers from the border, then a refinery sitting just a short distance from Belarus's own border with Ukraine is well within range. One strike on a facility like that could remove a critical piece of Russia's emergency fuel chain almost overnight. Ukrainian leadership has also made a specific point publicly, warning that any enterprise supplying fuel, weapons components, or drone infrastructure for Russia's war effort is effectively dragging Belarus deeper into the conflict itself, whether Minsk officially declares involvement or not. That is not a subtle message. It is a direct warning that the current arrangement carries real risk, not just for Russia, but for Belarus as well. Every additional shipment that crosses that border pushes Belarus a little closer to a question its own leadership has spent years trying to avoid. How long can you keep fueling somebody else's war before that war quietly becomes your own? If this kind of deep, honest breakdown of what's actually happening inside Russia is something you want more of, subscribing genuinely makes a difference for this channel. It costs nothing on your end, and it means a lot on ours. Seriously, thank you for sticking around this long. There's one more angle worth examining before we wrap this up, because it explains why this crisis is so difficult for Moscow to simply wait out. Refineries are not quick to rebuild. Replacing specialized processing equipment, the exact components these drone strikes keep targeting, often requires parts and technology that Russia struggled to access even before the war, and access has only gotten harder since. Sanctions have cut off many of the suppliers who once provided this specialized machinery. That means every successful strike does not just cause a temporary outage. It can mean months, sometimes longer, before that specific unit comes back online, if it comes back online at all before getting hit again. Compare that timeline to how quickly a drone strike happens. A strike takes minutes. Repairing the damage can take months. That imbalance is the entire engine driving this crisis forward. As long as that gap between destruction and repair keeps widening, no amount of emergency imports from Belarus, India, Kazakhstan, or anywhere else can fully close it. Imports can soften a shortage. They cannot fix a refinery that no longer has the equipment needed to run at full capacity. This also explains why Belarus has become so important almost by accident. It is not that Belarus suddenly built enormous new refining capacity. It simply has functioning equipment that has not been targeted the way Russia's own facilities have. That single advantage, equipment that still works, has turned two modest, aging Soviet-era refineries into one of the most strategically important assets, propping up Russia's entire domestic fuel supply. It is almost hard to believe. Two refineries in a country most people rarely think about have quietly become one of the load-bearing pillars, keeping Russia's civilian economy from visibly buckling. And that dependency creates its own kind of vulnerability, one Ukraine is clearly aware of. A system that depends heavily on a small number of critical nodes is fragile by definition. Remove one of those nodes, and the entire structure has to absorb the shock somewhere else, usually badly. Whether or not Ukraine ultimately decides to extend its strike campaign into Belarusian territory, the mere fact that it could is now sitting in the background of every strategic decision Moscow makes about fuel distribution going forward, One more thing before we get to the end of this. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand what's actually happening behind the headlines instead of just the sanitized version, make sure you're subscribed, because this channel is going to keep tracking every one of these cracks as they appear. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. So let's step back and look at the full picture here. A country that has spent decades marketing itself as an energy superpower is now rationing fuel to its own citizens, sacrificing its most symbolically important territory to protect its capital, quietly reintroducing outdated fuel standards that will damage its own vehicles, and leaning on a smaller, poorer neighbor just to keep the lights on at gas stations. None of that happens to a country that is actually winning. This is what a slow, structural collapse looks like from the inside. Not a single dramatic moment, not one headline everyone remembers, but 1,000 small cracks. A shortage here, a rationing policy there, a subsidy quietly rewritten, a refinery repaired and then struck again before the repairs even finish. Each individual piece looks manageable on its own. Stacked together, they tell a very different story, one about a system slowly running out of room to maneuver. And the most striking part of all this might be the irony sitting right at the center of it. For years, Russia used its energy resources as a tool of pressure over its neighbors, cutting off gas, threatening supply, reminding smaller countries exactly who held the power in that relationship. Today, that same country is quietly asking one of those smaller neighbors for help, just to keep its own citizens from sitting in gas lines. The balance of leverage that Moscow spent decades building has started, in this one specific way, to tilt in the opposite direction. Every tanker car that rolls out of Mosul or Novopolotsk carrying fuel back into Russia is proof of something the Kremlin would rather nobody notice. That the machine built to make Russia untouchable on energy is no longer running the way it used to. Pipelines that once symbolized power now symbolize dependence. A country that once dictated terms to its neighbors now waits for their help. Think about how this story would have sounded just a few years ago. A Russian official calmly explaining that gasoline is arriving from Morocco. A governor in a major Russian city publicly apologizing for empty pumps. Crimea, the crown jewel of Russian territorial ambition, placed under stricter fuel rationing than regions that were never part of the fighting at all. None of that fits the image Russia spent decades building of itself as an energy powerhouse, immune to this kind of ordinary grinding scarcity. And yet, here we are, watching exactly that unfold in real time, region by region, tanker car by tanker car. What makes this especially dangerous for the Kremlin is that fuel shortages are almost impossible to hide or spin away completely. You can control state television. You can shape the narrative around military operations far from public view. You cannot make an empty gas pump look full. Every driver who sits in a rationing line experiences the failure directly with their own eyes, regardless of what officials claim on the news that same evening. That kind of direct, undeniable experience spreads faster and cuts deeper than any official statistic ever could. There's a certain kind of irony in watching a country built on the promise of energy dominance now measuring its own stability in tanker cars borrowed from a neighbor it once treated as an afterthought. Power, in the end, is not just about what you can extract from the ground. It is about whether you can turn what you have into something usable, reliably, month after month, without leaning on someone else to do it for you. Right now, Russia cannot fully do that on its own, and everyone watching closely, from Kiev to Washington to ordinary Russian drivers standing in line, already knows it. So here's the question worth sitting with as you close this video. If a nation with some of the largest oil reserves on Earth cannot keep its own gas stations reliably stocked, what does that tell you about everything else happening behind the scenes that we don't get to see? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video helped you understand something you didn't before, share it with someone who still thinks Russia's economy is holding up just fine. Because behind the official statements and the calm television broadcasts, the queues at the pump are telling a very different story. One the Kremlin cannot subsidize away forever. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.